Across all 5 of the major Kansas cattle towns, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Caldwell, over a 15-year stretch from 1870 to 1885, historians have documented exactly 45 violent deaths. That's an average of fewer than 2 per year across 5 towns combined. The gunfighter image that Hollywood built an entire industry around? The numbers don't support it. Hey, welcome back. I'm Clay. Today we're going after one of the most deeply embedded myths in American history, the idea that cowboys died with their guns drawn. The reality was quieter than that, and a great deal uglier. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover the real West on this channel, not the one they sell you at the movie theater. Let's get into it. Here is a number worth sitting with. Historians estimate that fewer than 2% of working cowboy deaths during the cattle drive era, roughly 1865 to 1895, resulted from gunshot wounds inflicted by another person. Fewer than 2%. Historian Robert Dykstra spent years analyzing the records of the Kansas cattle towns, and what he found doesn't resemble a single Western film ever made. The 5 most famous cow towns in Kansas combined killed fewer people per cattle season than a moderately busy weekend in a mid-sized city today. Dodge City, in its 9 most active years, recorded 17 homicides total, less than 2 per year. That number matters because it reframes everything. If gunfights weren't the danger, what was? The answer starts with horses. Not the romantic, cooperative horses of the movies, the actual, working horses of the cattle drives, which were half-wild animals running on exhaustion and instinct. Being thrown, kicked, or dragged was, by most accounts from the era, the single leading cause of death for working cowboys. It was also the most common cause of serious injury, which, in the context of a cattle drive, meant something entirely different than it does today. When a cowboy's boot caught in the stirrup and his horse spooked, there was no stopping what came next. The animal ran. Trail bosses and veteran drovers knew this, and they wrote about it plainly, not as a dramatic event, but as a routine occupational hazard, the kind of thing you accepted as part of the work. Primary accounts from trail hands on the Great Texas drives through the 1870s and 80s describe horse accidents with the same flat matter-of-factness used to describe fence repairs or lousy weather, because to them, that's what it was. The working relationship between a cowboy and his horse was not what the movies suggest. A trail hand rode multiple horses per day, often 3 or 4 animals from the remuda, the herd of spare mounts that traveled alongside the drive. These were not trained companions. They were working tools, and some of them were dangerous ones. Cowboys broke their own horses on the job, often with minimal time and no safe enclosure. A horse that threw its rider at a full gallop on uneven ground in the dark, which is when many accidents happened, was a horse that could kill a man without malice and without drama. It simply ran. Charles Goodnight, one of the most respected cattlemen in Texas history, was meticulous about documenting what happened on his drives. The records from his operations and those of his contemporaries show a consistent pattern. Falls from horses, kicks to the skull, animals rolling on a pinned rider. These were the injuries that ended careers and ended lives. And they were invisible to the mythology because there was no story in them. No villain, no showdown. Just a horse running and a man left behind. Beyond direct accidents, the horse was also the instrument through which stampedes killed men. And that is a subject that deserves its own chapter, because nothing in the Hollywood version of cowboy life comes close to the reality of a stampede on the open plains. The problem was that a trail herd of 3,000 head of cattle, a standard drive size, represented roughly 9,000 pounds of beef per animal, moving together in the same direction in the dark. Cowboys described the sound of an approaching stampede as a low, continuous rumble that that traveled through the ground before you could hear it in the air. By the time you heard it in the air, you were already out of time. A drover named Teddy Blue Abbott, who rode the trail through most of the 1880s and left behind one of the more honest and detailed first-person accounts of cattle drive life, wrote about stampedes with unusual directness. He described riding a dead run in complete darkness, not knowing whether the next step would find ground or a prairie dog hole, a cut bank, or the edge of a ravine, and doing it anyway, because that was the job. The cattle had to be turned. If they weren't turned, they scattered across 50 square miles of open range and the drive was finished. So you rode. Men died in those rides, not dramatically, not with last words or a hat-trick shot across a canyon. They went down in the dark, and when the sun came up, the crew found what was left and noted it in the ledger. Charles Russell, the great cowboy artist and writer, documented one such death in a short story called Long Rope's Last Guard, drawing on the kind of event he had seen firsthand during his years working the Montana range. The accounts are remarkably similar across sources. A man is there, and then he isn't, and the cattle are still running, and the night goes on. The stampede and the lightning storm were, across most of the cattle drive era, the same event. Storms on the Great Plains moved differently than storms most people know. There are no mountain ranges to slow them, no substantial tree cover to interrupt the wind. And for a man on horseback in the middle of an open plain, there is nothing between him and the sky. The storms came fast. They arrived at night more often than not, and they brought lightning that drover accounts describe in terms that read today more like nightmare than weather report. Teddy Blue Abbott, who became one of the most cited first-person sources on trail drive conditions, wrote this without embellishment. Lots of cowpunchers were killed by lightning, and that is history. He was knocked off his horse by a lightning strike on 2 separate occasions. One Texas trail boss recalled a single storm in which 5 men were knocked off their horses simultaneously, and 7 horses in camp were killed outright. These were not freak events described as such. They were described as the kind of thing that happened in storm season. The implication throughout the primary record is clear. Lightning on the open range was not a rare catastrophe. It was a professional hazard with a body count. The mechanism connecting lightning and stampedes was simple and well known. A bolt near the herd was usually sufficient to send 3,000 animals in the same direction at once. Sometimes it was the thunder. Sometimes it was the static charge that built up before the storm hit. Trail hands wrote about seeing the electricity crawl along the horns of the cattle and across the ears of their horses, a phenomenon they called foxfire. John Kendrick, who came up the trail in 1879, recalled nights where the only visible thing was the light running along the cattle's horns and the glow of electricity moving across the ground itself. Then the herd moved. And if a man survived the stampede and the lightning, the cold could still take him. The northern ranges of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas operated on a different calendar than Texas. The cattle seasons overlapped with winters that were not the mild inconveniences of the southern plains. They were documented killers. The winter of 1886 to 1887, called the Big Die-Up by the men who survived it, is the single most destructive event in the recorded history of the American cattle industry, and it killed cowboys along with the cattle. The setup was a drought summer. By the time the first snows hit in November of 1886, the ranges were nearly stripped bare and the cattle were already weakened. Then the blizzards came. A 10-day storm swept in on the 9th of January, 1887. 16 inches of snow fell in as many hours. Temperatures at Bismarck, North Dakota dropped to 43 degrees below zero. At Glendive, Montana, unofficial readings touched 35 below. A brief thaw followed, a Chinook wind that melted the surface snow, and then an Arctic blast locked the water into a layer of ice across the range, sealing whatever forage remained under a surface cattle could not break through. Men went out to try to save the stock. Some of them did not come back. The accounts from ranchers, from trail hands, from frontier correspondents describe cowboys found frozen in the open, having lost their bearings in a whiteout. Ranch hands from the XIT Ranch in the Texas Panhandle, from operations in Montana, from the Dakota ranches invested in by men including the future President Theodore Roosevelt, all of them have entries in the historical record about hands who went out and were found days later, or not found at all until the spring thaw. Roosevelt himself wrote to his friend Henry Cabot Lodge after the winter broke, describing losses as crippling and himself as utterly unable to enjoy a visit to his ranches. He had invested heavily into North Dakota operations. The losses nearly broke him financially. For the working cowboys who survived, the men who actually rode for wages with no capital behind them and no ranch of their own, the losses were of a different kind.
Their employers went bankrupt. The outfits that had offered steady work and the traditional courtesy of an open door through the winter simply ceased to exist. The cowboys who once could count on riding the chuck line, moving from ranch to ranch, trading labor for meals and a place to sleep, found those ranches empty or locked. And what do you think? Could a man have stayed alive through that winter with nothing but his horse, his bedroll, and 60 miles between him and the nearest town? Drop your answer in the comments. Before the blizzards of 1886, before the lightning and the stampedes, there was the river crossing. And the river crossing was, across every trail from Texas to the northern ranges, the place where the drive held its breath. The Chisholm Trail crossed the Red River on its way north out of Texas. The Red River was not a fixed obstacle with a known depth and a predictable current. It was a braided, shifting, red-silted waterway that could be ankle-deep on a dry week and a quarter-mile of racing floodwater after rain in the watershed 200 miles south. Cowboys crossed it, not knowing what they were entering. There were 4 established crossing points: Ringgold, Red River Station, Rock Crossing, and Doan's Crossing, and all of them had graves nearby. A trail driver writing about one of the early crossings at Doan's Crossing noted, matter-of-factly, that the crossing had been in use for only a year or two, and already 5 graves stood on the near bank, one of them less than 10 days old. That was the note of a man describing occupational context, not tragedy. He was warning the reader about what the river could do, and he did it by pointing at the ground. George Duffield, a drover who kept a diary of his 1866 drive north from Texas, recorded a single line for the 31st of May. One of the party drowned today. His name was Carr. Several narrow escapes, Duffield wrote, and I was among them. That was the entire entry for a day on which a man died. The work continued. The cattle still had to get across. Swimming cattle across a flooding river required cowboys to enter the water on horseback and maintain the lead animals in the crossing. If the lead steers turned back, the whole herd reversed, and the cattle pile-up in the current could take men and animals down together. Henry Coates, riding point on one such crossing, had his horse go under midstream. The leaders turned. The whole herd reversed in the current. The chaos that followed nearly drowned several more men before the crossing was abandoned for the day. This was a documented incident from a named drover, recorded in first-hand accounts that historians have cross-referenced against multiple trail records. The Arkansas River was another consistent hazard on the drives through Kansas. Flash flooding on that river killed animals and men with the same indifference the Red River showed. Michael Grauer, curator of the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, has noted that drowning happened all the time on the trail, not occasionally, not in famous incidents, but routinely, steadily, and largely without monument. The graves of the men who went down at river crossings are, as he put it, virtually all unmarked. This is the part of the story that gets replaced in popular memory. The river crossings were not the backdrop for a gunfight. They were not the setting for a hero's moment. They were simply where a substantial number of working men died quietly, in cold water, trying to move cattle north for wages that amounted to roughly $30 a month. They left no dramatic record. Their names, when they appear at all, appear in a single line of a diary or in the note beside a grave that the grass covered in a season. The drives that survived the rivers and the lightning and the stampedes and the ice then faced a reality that most surviving accounts mention with the same tone as everything else: the medical reality of the open range. A broken arm in 1880 was not a broken arm. It was a problem that required a doctor within a reasonable time frame, or it became something else: an infection, a misset bone, a fever that took hold in the tissue and moved toward the chest. On a cattle drive, the nearest physician could be 100 miles away, and the trail did not stop moving for an injured man. The chuck wagon carried a limited medicine kit. Trail cooks, who doubled as the closest thing a drive had to a medic, kept laudanum for pain and a saw for the worst cases. Amputation was not a last resort in the 1880s. It was often the first serious option for a limb injury with signs of infection, because surgeons knew from experience what an untreated infection in a limb became within a week. But there was no surgeon. There was the cook, and there was the laudanum, and there was the open sky and the next river crossing still ahead. The references in trail accounts to blood poisoning are frequent enough to be unremarkable. A man was kicked by a horse. The wound was cleaned and wrapped as well as it could be. By the time the drive reached the railhead, he was dead or very close to it. Andy Adams, whose Log of a Cowboy is considered by historians one of the most accurate accounts of trail life ever written, he called it only slightly fictionalized, describes injuries handled with a pragmatism that reads today as brutal. Because it was. There was no other option. Even for the men who survived all of it, the rivers, the lightning, the cold, the injuries, the physical toll of the work itself was cumulative and severe. The average working cowboy's career lasted fewer than 7 years. Not because men chose to leave, because the body gave out. Years of riding in all weather, sleeping on hard ground, eating trail food, taking falls, working in wet clothing for days at a stretch. A man in his early 30s who had ridden the trail since his late teens was often broken down in ways that no amount of rest would fully reverse. Joint damage, chronic injuries from falls that healed wrong, hearing loss from years of riding near large, loud animals, vision damage from years in the sun and dust. And when the body gave out, there was nothing waiting. No pension, no recognition from the cattle companies that had employed them. The industry that depended entirely on the labor of young men willing to take lethal risks for $30 a month had no mechanism for those men when the work was done. Many former cowboys ended up in low-wage agricultural labor or drifted into the growing western towns as unskilled workers, carrying bodies that had been used hard and were finished ahead of schedule. The winter of 1886 to 87 accelerated this process for thousands of men at once. When the spring thaw came and the full extent of the losses was clear, cattle piled against drift fences across hundreds of miles of plain, rivers choked with the overflow from ranches that had lost up to 90% of their herds. The large open range outfits that had employed most of the working cowboys on the northern range simply did not recover. In Custer County, Montana alone, the tax rolls listed 200 ranchers in 1886. By 1888, there were 120. The cowboys those ranches had employed scattered. Some found work on smaller, fenced operations. Many did not. The cattle drive era, from roughly 1867, when the first major drives north from Texas began, to the late 1880s, when the combination of barbed wire, the railroads, and the die-up closed it down, lasted about 20 years. In that time, the men who did the actual work were not the men who profited from it. They were young. They were often recent immigrants or formerly enslaved men who could find no other employment.
and they traded their physical futures for wages that made no one wealthy and left no cushion for the years ahead. None of that is in the movie. The movie has the gunfight, the showdown, the dramatic exit. The history has a diary entry that reads, "One of our party drowned today, several narrow escapes, and I among them." Could you have lasted a season on one of those drives? The river crossings, the lightning, the stampedes, the cold? Let us know what you think in the comments.